Now from Indianapolis, economist Milton Friedman and his wife talk about school choice for parents. They recently established an educational foundation to promote parental choice from kindergarten through 12th grade. The event runs 1 hour.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am privileged to introduce one of the most important and influential economists of all time, and a truly infuriating but necessary and endearing man, Dr. Milton Friedman.
Thank you all very much. Almost everybody recognizes that too many children come out of our schools unable to read, write, or figure. I am told, by Gordon, of course, that only about half of the students who enter Indianapolis high schools this year can be expected to graduate. That's not special at all to Indianapolis. It's true in many cities around the country. Pat Rooney provided me with an editorial from the Washington Post that tells about another place that's even worse, namely the District of Columbia. And I want to quote in one sentence, which that editorial quoted from an official report of on the District of Columbia schools. And it said, and I quote, "For each additional year that students stay in District of Columbia schools, the less likely they are to succeed. Not because they are unable to succeed, but because the system does not prepare them to succeed." Now, can you think of a worse indictment of an educational system than that the longer students stay in it, the worse they are? I thought it was zero progress. I hadn't realized that this was an institution which was producing negative progress. That's a tragedy. It's a tragedy for the students, especially for those among them who have the qualities and the desire and the urge to do something, to make something of themselves, and there are many of them at every level in our society. But it's also a tragedy for our society. It's a dual tragedy. It's a social tragedy because it is generating a society of haves and have-nots, of those who are schooled and those who are not schooled. If that continues, if our country gets divided into these two classes, it will be impossible to maintain a decent democratic society. But it's also a tragedy from the point of view of our prosperity and development. We have great opportunities in this world that arise out of the enormous technological developments of the last few centuries, as well as out of the political developments. Worldwide, countries are leaving the idea of central direction, of government control, and moving into the free market area. We have a tremendous opportunity, but we will not be able to take advantage of it if so many of our students are so many of our adults are functionally illiterate. Now, it's not always been that way, by no means. Rose and I both went to public schools and got what we regarded as a good education. And that's probably true of many of the people in this room. You too went to public schools. But things are different today. They are not what they were when Rose and I were going to school or when many of you were going to school. They're not what they were for many reasons. They're not what they were because of social developments, changes in culture, changes in attitude. But one of the most important reasons why they're not what they were is because of the extent to which you have had a shift of responsibility for schools from local people, from the parents in the community, to distant bureaucrats, supposed professional educators and teachers' unions. When Rose and I were in school, there were 150,000 school districts in this country. Today, there are 15,000 for a population that is twice as large. From a large number of small districts which were in competition with one another, and where parents and local people had something to say, our governmental educational system has moved in the direction of large aggregates controlled from the State Department, from the state capital, or from the federal government. In addition, the schools have become a monopoly run by the teachers' unions. Like it or not, that's the case of our so-called public schools. 90% of the kids in this country are going to public schools. They should not be called public schools. They should be called government schools. They're government schools run by the teachers' union. The people who run the school have very little incentive to satisfy their captive customers. They don't have to pay any attention to their students because their students are captives. They've got to go there. They have nowhere else to go. And they have every incentive to make life easier for themselves. It may surprise you to know that the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers, between them, certainly the strongest and most important pressure group in this country, those two agencies have more than 3,500 staff members, each receiving more than $100,000 in wages and benefits. That's an amazing figure. Where does the money to pay those wages and benefits come from? It comes from you, the taxpayers, indirectly through the teachers' salaries, part of which they have to turn over to the teachers' union. I say have to, because in most places of the country, you have a closed shop, a union contract. And unlike most industries, the union is not bargaining with the people who are spending their own money. If Lilly has a dispute with a union, it's Lilly's money that's involved. But when a teachers' union has a conference and a conflict with a school board, they're talking about somebody else's money, the taxpayers' money. And that doesn't exercise the same kind of restraint. The French say, cherchez la femme. The economist says, look for the incentive. If you want to know what people are going to do, don't talk to them, don't ask them what they say, but see what it is in their self-interest to do, and that's what they'll do. So in order to change this situation, we have to change the incentives of the people who now run the system. How can we do that? The way to change the incentives is to empower parents so that they can choose the schools their children attend. More than 40 years ago, I suggested that if a parent chose to send his child to a private school, he or she is saving the government the cost of schooling that child, and he should be received a sum, a voucher. I didn't use the word voucher there, but that's what's come to be called. He should receive a sum equal to at least part of what he's saving the government. It's really a tax rebate, because the money that is going to school the children is coming from the taxpayers. But if a parent chooses to send a child to a private school, that parent has to pay twice, once in the form of tuition and once in the form of taxes. That's a very unjust and undesirable system. It's an unjust system because it enables those who can afford it to have choice. Those of us in the upper and middle classes, we have choice as to where we send our children. If we don't like the schools in the district where we are, we can move to a different district. If we don't like that, we can send them to a private school. But the vast majority of the people in this country do not have that kind of choice. They are condemned, they are required, they have no alternative but to send their child to the local governmental school. If you had a system under which parents could choose, it would level the playing field, both for the parent and for the providers of schooling. Because right now, it's equally true that the providers of schooling do not have a level field. How would you like to try to sell something when somebody down the street is giving it away for free? Not an easy thing to do. That's why so many of our private schools now are adjuncts of churches or nonprofit groups of other kind, because they are the only groups in the society that are in a position to subsidize the schools and therefore to compete with the public schools. If indeed every parent had a voucher which would enable him to choose the school his child goes to, you would have a major market for new and innovative approaches to schools. The public schools would have to meet the competition or risk losing their students. The result of it would be that the public schools would improve. They would no longer have a monopoly. Just consider what has happened in other areas of our society when we have broken a monopoly. Telephones used to be a monopoly. They no longer are. And there has been an enormous improvement in the quality, the cost of telephone services. The post office used to have a monopoly, in effect, even on partial delivery and on special delivery. They no longer do. UPS, Federal Express, and a host of other services have shown how you can innovate in that area. Wherever you look, government monopolies share one characteristic. They produce a low-quality product at a high cost. That's just as true of government monopolies in the United States as it was of government monopolies in the Soviet Union. It's the nature of the beast. If you could have such a revolution, and a revolution it would be, if every parent had the same freedom of choice than most of those in this room and we do for their children, the benefits would go well beyond the students who would receive a better education. There's much talk about a decline in values. There would be an enormous improvement in values if we had the kind of educational system we can imagine. Today, you have a socialist educational system. And a socialist educational system will teach socialist values. A free market educational system will teach free market values. Every system reflects its basic nature. From an industrial point of view, you would have a better educated, a more skilled labor pool. Businesses around the country are finding it difficult to attract the kind of workers they want because so large a fraction of the products of our school system can't read, write, or figure, are functionally illiterate. Sociological benefits. If you had an improved labor pool, it would tend to counteract the division I was speaking of earlier, the tendency for there to be a widening diversity between the incomes received by those who are skilled and schooled and those who are not. It would have a financial advantage. You would have better education at half the cost, and the burden on taxpayers would go down. There's a small town in Texas that has recently introduced the equivalent of a complete educational voucher system. What is it, Travis?
Lake Travis.
Lake Travis, Texas. And the reason they did it was because they were faced with having to build more schools. They were having more kids to school. And they saw this as a way in which they could lessen the burden on themselves in the future. And I should point out that it would be a technological advantage. You would have a major new industry develop. We currently spend in this country close to $300 billion on elementary and secondary schooling. If you had a really free market industry, if all parents were free to choose, you had an open market, a free market, I predict that at least half the kids would end up in private, for-profit schools. That would be, however, the cost would be cut in half. The $300 billion would become $150 billion. But $75 billion is a pretty good industry. What's the pharmaceutical industry in this country?
Total comes to about $70 or $80 billion.
Yeah, so it would be a new industry, the equivalent in size to the U.S. pharmaceutical industry. Not bad. And note in all of this, the benefits would be very widespread, but the group that would benefit most are the people in this country now who are most disadvantaged. The low-income groups, particularly in the urban areas. They are the ones who are now worst off. Ask yourself, there is no other way in which low-income people are so disadvantaged as with respect to the kind of schooling they can get for their children. They can buy the same, if they save their money and are frugal, they can buy the same clothes the rest of us can. They can buy the same television sets. They can buy the same radio. But they cannot buy the same schooling. In order to do that, unless they can get the benefit of a program like Pat Rooney's program, and there are only very few who can do that, they cannot afford to move to another area. They're stuck where they are. And they are the people who would benefit the most from having a free market educational system in which everybody was free to go to school. We're impressed with a number of groups around the country that are experimenting with different approaches to improving the quality of schooling. I've already mentioned Pat Rooney's efforts. Milwaukee and Cleveland have introduced programs involving choice. Charters are now all the rage. We believe, Rose and I believe, that the best way to achieve effective schooling is through universal parental choice through educational vouchers. That's the best way to assure a truly equitable and innovative school system. However, maybe we're wrong. To borrow from Chairman Mao, let 100 flowers bloom, and let competition, not authority, decide which will develop. Our foundation will welcome all attempts, and we hope to cooperate with as wide a range of educational reformers as possible. Free competition is the best way to find out what works best, not only in the automobile industry, not only in drugs, not only in television, but also in the field of schooling. Thank you.
Dr. Friedman, the diversity and the intellectual curiosity of this audience to which I alluded is reflected in the questions that they have proposed to put to you. And those questions are, I'd say, roughly equally divided between questions specifically on the point of educational reform and then some with, that have to do with your views on broader questions. And I'll endeavor to do justice to each pile. Let me begin with a question on the education front. Should the amount of the voucher be determined by the family's income?
No. The amount of the voucher should be determined by what's regarded as an amount necessary to purchase an adequate schooling. It's a mistake, in my opinion, to let every policy become an income tax. We have a progressive income tax, so-called progressive. I think progressive is a misnomer. But we have an income tax in which higher incomes pay higher tax rates. If the society wants to redistribute income, that's a way to do it. But you shouldn't do it with respect to food, with respect to clothing, with respect to something else. We don't have a society in which if you go into a grocery store, before they sell you groceries, they ask what your income is. Why should we have any such, why should we, in the case of vouchers, do any differently? If we have vouchers, it's because it's been decided that it's important for children to get a schooling and to get the right kind of schooling. And that's important for all children, even for the children of well-to-do people.
How would you respond to the following argument against school vouchers? Namely, that offering vouchers to parents for use at private schools will leave public schools with the most undesirable students while siphoning necessary money from public education.
Well, it happens to be the other way around. At the moment, the most undesirable students in public schools are sent by the public schools to private schools. That's a fact, because you have in the public schools those cases that come up that are very difficult to teach, whether because of physical disability or other disabilities. What do the public schools do with them? In a very large fraction of cases, they send them to private schools so that they can do a good job. So that question simply reflects a misunderstanding of what the facts are. Now, after all, if you think of the way the free market operates, it provides a range of alternatives. If you don't like Italian food, you can get French food. If you don't like French food, you can get Mexican food. In the same way, if you have a real free market educational system, I don't know what it would look like. Because if I could imagine what it would look like, I'd be a planner. And I'm not. I believe the free market will be the best way to develop the alternatives. And there are now schools that specialize in treating very difficult, almost untreatable youngsters. And more would develop. So that I think the situation is almost exactly the opposite. That's one of the favorite arguments made by the teachers' unions. Albert Shanker is fond of saying the public schools have to take in everybody, but the private schools can choose their customers. But the fact of the matter is that the public schools don't, in fact, take in everybody. The hard ones they send away elsewhere.
Several of the questions reflected a concern about the future of teachers under a free choice system. And one of those questions was, what do we say to the dedicated teachers in public schools who could be offended or disadvantaged by a choice system?
The dedicated teachers in public schools are, next to the poor, the ones who would benefit the most. Right now, they're in schools under labor contracts which make pay depend almost entirely on seniority and hardly at all on performance. In a competitive market, the good teachers would be at a premium. There would be bidding for them. Moreover, if you opened it up, provided vouchers, got a new industry going, you'd have a new and better and bigger market for teachers, so that teachers, in my opinion, not members of not the officials of the teachers' union, not the bureaucrats, but the teachers. Today, I wonder how many of you realize that in most cases, I know what's true in the state of California, but in the state of California, less than half of the total money spent on government schools gets into the classroom. The teachers would have a better market and would be better off. Moreover, if you want to know what teachers think, ask the question, where do they send their children to school? And in every major city of this country, twice to 3 times as large a fraction of teachers send their children to private schools as the public at large. In the city of Chicago, I think it's something like 40% of the teachers send their children to private schools. So if you look at what they do, they're strongly in favor of private schools.
Where will new schools come from when a voucher system is in place? Why would anyone want to start a school, and what sort of people would you expect to do so?
Well, tell me, where did the new telephone companies come from when telephones were opened up? Where did the new airlines come from when airlines were deregulated? Where do the many companies that produce computers come from as the computer industry developed? If you provide a market, providers will come. And why will they come? Some will come because they've always wanted all their life to teach, but they haven't been able to find an opportunity. I have, as I say, for 40 years been talking about this. And at talk after talk before groups, I've had people come up to me later and say, you know, I've always wanted to teach, but I couldn't stand this kind of a system as it is now. And under your arrangements, I'd love to start a new school. And there would be no shortage of new schools that would be started. That's the one thing I'm absolutely confident about. Just think, anything you can think of. When there's a market, a market develops, a demand develops, the supply comes to meet it.
What about the needs of gifted children under a choice system?
That's a very good question, because I believe, Rose and I, and Rose tends to stress this especially, that one of the most important defects of our present educational system is that it does not tend to give sufficient opportunity to gifted students. I know in the state of California, government programs for disadvantaged students, 5 times as much is spent on them as is spent on government programs for gifted students. And yet, where have all advances in humanity come from? They've come from the gifted. It's the Einsteins, it's the Edisons. They are the ones who make the advances, and so on down the line. So that one of the great advantages of this is that undoubtedly different kinds of schools would develop, and some of them would specialize in treating gifted children. And after all, their parents would have the same opportunity. Right now, there are many gifted students, potentially gifted students, who never get a chance to develop because they are stuck in a uniform straitjacket of current school system. Now, don't misunderstand me. There are some very good schools in the public school system. There are many good, dedicated teachers, but they are all hampered by being in a system which puts a straitjacket on what they can do.
Will choice necessarily depend upon a family's ability to transport their children, and therefore work only for families who have that ability?
Are McDonald's stores only in places that you have to drive to, that are far away from where you live? In a free market, the suppliers will come to where their market is. And if you have a market for schooling in an area like what people are referring to, are thinking of the poor areas, the ghettos, New York, Los Angeles, and other places like that, the schools will come and set up there, just as a supermarket set up, just as other stores set up, so that it will not depend on the ability of people to pay for transportation. And there's, of course, nothing to prevent them from using some of their money for transportation. You know, it's not a bad idea. It isn't perverse to education that parents should contribute to the cost of their children's schooling. And what is most important is that there's a strong tendency to denigrate the interest and capacity of the low-income families in our country. Look, our parents were, today, both Rose's and my parents today their income would be well under the poverty level. But that didn't mean they weren't interested in our getting schooling. And Pat Rooney will testify to you about the people he has found in connection with his program, who make extreme sacrifices out of very low incomes in order to promote the interests of their children. And that's widespread. I think that there's a tremendous reservoir of parental interest and involvement that can only be tapped if you give it an opportunity to have something to say about where their children go to school and what they do.
We'll come back to education before closing, but we must take advantage of your presence here to allow some of our audience to ask
I'm not going to tell you what the stock
afield.
market will do.
Okay, there's... there went my question. We have 2 or 3 inquiries on the subject of Social Security, perhaps best expressed in a simple question. Is privatization the answer to the impending Social Security crisis?
Yes. If you want further elaboration of that, again, you now, fortunately, have an example of an operating system which is worth imitating, and that's the example in Chile, where, as you know, 15 years ago, they established a system fully privatized in which every worker could choose. He had the choice. He could stay in the government system, or he could choose to deposit, I think it's 10% of his wages, in a investment fund, of which there grew up a considerable number of different investment funds, that would be vested in his name and available for his future. Something like 90 or 95% of the workers chose that alternative. And it has been tremendously effective. It yielded a much higher rate of return than the government promised. It's one of the major factors why Chile has been the outstanding country in Latin America in terms of capital investment and development and productivity, improvement in its condition, because those funds have provided a great deal of the capital for that purpose. The same thing would happen in this country. Right now, we have a system. Well, don't get me started on this. As I think the Social Security system is a disgrace. As I always say, it's a combination of 2 elements, neither of one of which nobody would buy, but which together seem to be a magic something or other. You have a tax that nobody would buy, a flat tax on income up to a maximum. You have a system of benefits that nobody would buy. You wrap them together, it's a great feat of marketing.
What's your view of the progress toward one currency in Europe, and what will its effects be on the U.S. Economy?
I think that the movement toward one currency in Europe is a great mistake. It should never have been started. It may be completed, and if it is, it will not long thereafter break up. And the reason is very simple. You need political unity before you can have currency unity. You can only have a unified currency if you have just one central bank, one political authority. We can have a single money for the whole United States because there's only one Federal Reserve System. If the state of Indiana had a separate currency and a separate system, it wouldn't work. So in my opinion, I believe that it's a mistake. The reason it's moving the way it is not for economic reasons. It's purely for political reasons. It's a belief on the part of the leaders of France and Germany that unless they unify their currencies, they will not be able to prevent lapsing into the kind of political rivalry that led to the First and Second World War. But it makes no economic sense, in my opinion.
Your position on the proposed flat tax, and what chance does it have to become reality?
Has zero chance of becoming reality. Unfortunately, I'm strongly in favor of a flat tax. Why does it have zero chance? For purely political reasons. Tell me, how does a congressman raise campaign funds? What does he have to sell? You have to look at incentives. One of the most important things he has to sell is affecting the income tax. The most cherished position in the House of Representatives is on the Ways and Means Committee. And if you look at an analysis of where contributions go the members of the Ways and Means Committee outdistance all the rest in the amount of contributions they get. Why do you have it? Our tax system is terrible. But even so, it would be an enormous benefit if it could be kept the same for 5 or 10 years. Why do you have a change every second year? It's not every year, it's every other year. Why? Because that's when the congressmen have to raise campaign funds. And they sell changes in the income tax, or not changes. See, they have it both ways. They introduce a change, and then they're paid to take it out. And then somebody else pays them to introduce a change. And then somebody else pays them to take it out. And the fact is that the reason we have such a complicated, terrible tax system is for that political reason. If you really want to get a flat tax, I think you first have to get term limits.
Let's close then with a final question back on our main topic. One member of the audience asks, what are the best arguments against school choice, and how do you answer them?
In 40 years, I have found only one argument that I regard as a valid argument against school choice, and it is a valid argument. It's the argument that if you have vouchers, government financed, that will ultimately lead to control over the schools. It will increase the control over the schools. That is a valid argument. There's no question. He who pays the piper tends to call the tune. But it doesn't mean that it has to be the case. There are two things that can be used to mitigate against it. First, the money should not go from the state to the school. It should go to the parent. The best scheme for that I've so far heard is one that has been being developed by a fellow, Michael Rothschild in California, is to give the voucher in the form of a smart card, a card which has embedded in it a claim on a certain amount of money, which claim can be exercised only by selected receivers of the smart card. And you take that smart card to the school to which you want to send your child. They stick it into the machine and it transfers the tuition to them. By making it a scholarship to the parent and not to the school, you reduce in part the danger that comes from from control. Second, in every legislative measure we've seen, a voucher or otherwise, it contains a clause providing that the regulations and requirements on schools cannot be changed except with a supermajority. Note that the reason you have got this problem at all is not because of the public schools. It's because of compulsory education. If you have compulsory schooling, you have to have some way of identifying whether the child is complying with it. And that means you have to have a list of approved schools. And that's where the problem comes from, and that will not be changed. Finally, if you can have a universal voucher applying to everybody and build up a substantial private system, it will in turn offer a counter force to the attempt by government to impose regulation. It will try to defend itself against that, and I think it will succeed. You know, let me give you an example. We have food stamps. That's the same kind of thing. Does the government control the grocery stores? But I want to leave you with one other thought. Let's suppose the government said that food stamps could be spent only in grocery stores run by the government. What kind of grocery stores do you think you'd have?
Dr. Friedman, thank you for coming to our city and for bringing this cause to our city. May I have a round of applause, please, for Milton and Rose Friedman.
Thank you. Thank you.